So polycrisis just refers to how different crises and shocks interact and get entangled so that it gives us a predicament that's kind of more complicated than if we were just to look at problems in isolation. And so like traditionally a lot of environmentalists have just kind of focused on climate change as like, that's the main problem. We got to focus all our efforts on climate change. And it very well may be, it likely is the kind of the biggest crisis we face. But then the real kind of fiendishly difficult challenge is how do we address climate change when that intersects with all these other crises like economic stagnation and inequality and oligarchic hollowing out of democracy and escalating geopolitical rivalries and wars around the world. And these crises are all interconnected and can potentially amplify each other. So, when you have wars around the world, like in Ukraine or the genocide in Gaza, that has massive implications for the climate and the environment, as well as creating immense human suffering. And then that can also have impacts on energy markets and food prices, leading to cost of living crises. And then if that leads governments to water down climate policies because they want to focus on immediate, economic goals or immediate cost of living issues, then, they kind of put climate policy to the back burner as not a priority. And then, that can then ultimately reinforce the climate crisis. And then that can just make some of these shocks even worse, by ignoring the climate crisis. Then obviously climate shocks, heat waves, drought, shocks to energy and food systems gets worse. And so you just kind of have a self-sustaining crisis configuration where all these different shocks kind of make it harder to address them all. And so one of the goals of polycrisis thinking is to try and think holistically about the problems we face, as opposed to just, putting them into little boxes and addressing them separately. But I'm interested in general in, I'm interested in the politics of mental health and the way in which mental health issues get framed. And so certainly in Western societies, mental health is often seen as, an individual concern, as it's just a matter of people being able to cope with the world as it is. And if they fail to cope, then, it's their problem and they need to seek therapy or medication to deal with it. And they tend to, at least mainstream perspectives, tend to downplay or ignore the role of social structures like capitalism and alienation from labor and from each other, alienation from nature in terms of being important causes of the mental health problems that we're facing. And so climate change, again, you can take kind of a polycrisis lens here because mental health is impacted by multiple intersecting crises. And so, on one hand, climate change, is a major source of stress for people's mental health, especially for young people. It can be, on one hand, people who suffer from acute climate disasters, like losing their homes in a massive flood or a wildfire, that's a very traumatic event that can have long-term mental health impacts. But also people who so far have relative safety from climate can also experience negative mental health because they fear about the future, they fear about the impacts it will have on them and their children and others that they care about. And they also are angered, not just, they feel scared, not just scared about the climate crisis itself, but they feel angry and ignored and often gaslighted by the people in power who are ignoring these things or trying to downplay the crisis or say, you young people are being over emotional or hysterical about this crisis. And so, there's all sorts of ways. So it's not just the climate crisis itself that can lead to negative mental health, but the way politicians and media often frame it and in a downplaying way that doesn't take the challenge seriously. And so those are some of the ways that climate change and mental health are connected. I'm also interested, one way that's less talked about, that they're connected, that I'm interested in, is the way in which mental health crises can potentially reinforce, make climate change, in some ways indirectly make climate change worse, because people suffering from poor mental health, it can in many cases lead to, burnout, people feeling exhausted, apathetic, not really able to feel engaged in politics or engaged in activism and trying to change the world. There's more of a sense of like I'm too overwhelmed and burned out. Like I have to just focus on taking care of, myself or those close to me. And that's a completely understandable impulse. But at the same time, if we're all feeling burned out and overwhelmed, it makes it harder for us to devote our collective energies or to be part of a collective movement to try and address these huge problems like climate change. So that's another kind of less talked about way in which, mental health crises can have a negative impact on climate politics. And so I think one of the big questions is how do we bring these struggles together for both struggles for better mental health and for climate protection, because we need to address both together. And again, that's like where a polycrisis lens can potentially be valuable, because it is saying, we got to address these problems holistically. And that's to a large extent, I think, there's a lot of reasons for that. To some extent, it's the fault of the mainstream environmental movement, because for a long time, they only cared about climate change and seemed to care more about polar bears than about, ordinary people, that kind of thing. And they often were perceived as being kind of arrogant and talking down to working people and not taking their concerns seriously about jobs and stable income and the impact that climate policy might have on working class communities, and just kind of brushing those aside or not taking them as seriously. And while today, the climate activists and mainstream organizations, they recognize that problem more, and they recognize the need to work with working class communities and to have a more intersectional analysis that looks at, the intersection between climate change and, class and structural racism and other things. But there's still a sense in which a lot of, at least the mainstream climate organizations, it seems like maybe they do it a little bit kind of not necessarily authentically. They're trying to talk the talk to make it seem like they care about working class communities and marginalized populations, but to what extent they really care, or to what extent that's really shown in their activism and kind of the kinds of programs they're doing is, some would question it. But then there's also just legacies of mistrust, I think, because of the way that they've operated in the past and often continue to do so. That tends to alienate other people from the movement. And I think even the left, the kind of the more radical left, in terms of those who at least more explicitly care about, the most marginalized and care about the working class, like most of us, or a lot of us, tend to come from, very educated, often middle upper class backgrounds that often are disconnected from the lived experiences of working class communities and other marginalized populations. And so, and of course not all of us, but many of us, myself included, like come from those more privileged backgrounds, very, highly educated backgrounds. And so it can form challenges to cross those divides and to build a popular movement that isn't just pandering to the upper educated, upper middle class professionals, and but instead building a truly, intersectional, working class, diverse climate movement. And so I think that climate change can be parts of a kind of a more unifying project to try and change the world for the better, in the interest of the majority of people. But I think that to do that, we would also need to see climate change as, not necessarily any more important than other issues that working class people are dealing with, bread and butter economic issues. And so we need to bring those things together about, cost of living, cost of energy and food and housing, and have a climate program that is addressing climate protection while, improving people's needs in the here and now, or improving people's standard of living and their security, their economic security. So I think that's got to be the goal. And if we can do something like that, then I think that can be more unifying. But it's hard to do in practice. Yeah, so how do we, given the world, given all the suffering, especially among young people today, suffering under capitalism and climate change and kind of elites, out of touch elites who seem to not really care about our futures, how do we build a mass movement to challenge all these problems together? And doing that while recognizing that a lot of us are also suffering from exhaustion and burnout. How do we do that? And I think we can do that, but I think that's one of the challenges, and that's one of the things I'm thinking about. both are potentially true. I think that I think it's important to push back against, to some extent, because I mean, in one sense, we often hear from kind of liberal mainstream perspectives on climate change that like we're all in this together, and we have to we have to put aside our differences and we got to address this challenge. And so, I mean, of course, in some sense that's true, but at the other hand, that can ignore really vast inequalities in terms of access to resources and power relations, shaped by class, shaped by race and gender and geography and all these things. And so, the fact is that we're not really all in this together. There are very stark power differentials in the world in terms of who has access to luxury bunkers, for instance. You got the super rich buying up land in New Zealand and Hawaii and elsewhere and building these, multi-story luxury bunkers underground equipped with swimming pools and all these things to protect themselves if in case the world burns and collapses. At least they have their luxury bunkers. So certainly for them, we're not all in this together. And I think it is indeed the case that there are these differences. And so I guess it's important to, in one sense, recognize that we're not all in this together, and that at least certain segments of the ruling class are very content to let the world burn and to kind of escape in their own way, whether that means escaping into their luxury bunkers or going to Mars or, whatever it is, wherever it is they want to go. But at the same time, the goal, I think, is to have something that unifies the people, or ordinary people, those who are not billionaires, or those who don't have access to lots of wealth where they can escape the worst effects of the climate crisis. So most of us who are going to be in some way affected, even if that's still there's still a lot of differences in terms of class and race and our exposure, our vulnerability. But, those who aren't in that, elite category are going to be most vulnerable to climate change. And so how do we try and build more unity, or at least more solidarity among those of us, the people who are excluded from the luxury bunkers, so to speak? I think that's a big challenge, because right now the politics of climate is very divisive along left, right, along urban, rural populations, among the college educated and the non-college educated.